Hi, Blueprint LSAT. I'm Zach Pelchat, and this is my potential instructor video for question 2. So the stem of this next problem tells us that it's a flaw in the reasoning problem. Now, as test takers, we want to get to the point that when we see this stem, we know that there's already a flaw in the argument, and we know why the argument is flawed. We also want to know what the fundamental error of reasoning is in the problem. We don't want to get tricked into looking at an answer choice that's really addressing a flaw other than the main error of reasoning. Though most of the time those types of answers have to be thrown out anyway because their language is too strong or something like that. We also don't want to get sucked into wasting our time looking for an answer that could be really great but just isn't one of the answer choices. So how do we identify a flaw in an argument? Well, we do this the same way we should approach any logical reasoning question. We want to look and identify its conclusion and the premises that got us to that conclusion. So this problem gives us two premises. The first one has to do with the average length of stay at two hospitals. At University Hospital, the average length of stay is 6 days. At Edgewater Hospital, the average length of stay is 4 days. The second premise says that patients with similar illnesses have similar recovery times. Then the argument goes on to conclude that University Hospital could lower its average length of stay from 6 days to Edgewater's 4 days without impacting quality of care. Okay. So where is the flaw? Well, the premises are talking about two different groups. The first premise is talking about the group of patients as a whole at both hospitals. The second premise is talking about patients with similar illnesses, which is likely a subgroup within the larger group of all patients. The conclusion then makes a claim about all patients. Okay. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be a problem if the hospitals are only going to treat patients with similar illnesses or similar problems. So, for example, maybe both hospitals treat only patients with fistulas. It's all fistulas all the time. Now, and I can't emphasize this enough, do not image search that. But if that was the case, the patients would have the same illnesses and they would recover at similar rates. And so then we would be right to wonder why Edgewater Hospital is able to discharge its patients 2 days faster than University Hospital. But what if, as is much more likely the case, the hospitals have some overlap between patients that have similar illnesses, but they also treat patients that have different illnesses and conditions? So maybe University Hospital is in a much rougher part of town, and it deals with a lot of gunshot wound victims where the bullet has hit every organ in their body. And Edgewater Hospital deals with a lot of one-night stayovers after cosmetic surgery. Now, obviously, the recovery rates between those two groups are going to be very different. And if University Hospital lowered its average length of stay to match Edgewater's, it would almost certainly be negatively impacting quality of care for those gunshot wound victims. So, if we look at the answers, we see that choice C matches up nearly perfectly with this flaw that we just identified. That the premises are really referring to two different groups. Choice C says that the hospitals might treat patients who have different illnesses. That works great. But let's look at the other answers to see why they're wrong. That's always a good thing to do. So choice A says that the argument equates average length of stay with quality of care. Now, our conclusion says that we can actually lower the average length of stay without affecting quality of care. So it clearly can't be equating those two things. If anything, the argument is guilty of saying that average length of stay might not be so relevant to quality of care. which I'll address momentarily. Choice B uses words like ensures and requires, and that sort of language should tip us off that it's referring to a mix-up between sufficient and necessary conditions. So on that answer, the argument would be saying that a reduction in average length of stay ensures or is sufficient for quality of care being unaffected. And that would be the flaw, and it really should be saying, according to that answer, that the reduction in average length of stay is necessary to maintain quality of care. But the argument isn't claiming that at all. It's not saying that it's necessary, just that it's possible that we can reduce the average length of stay. Okay? So that answer doesn't work. But it is good to focus on the language that's in choice B, because a mix-up between necessary and sufficient conditions is a very common flaw in reasoning that the LSAT likes to test. So becoming familiar with that sort of language is a really good thing. This type of answer could easily be the correct answer just for on another question. Choice D is way too extreme of an answer choice, mostly because of the word never that's in there. The answer, or the argument isn't saying that the average length of stay has nothing to do with recovery rates. It's just saying that in this case, we could go from 6 days to 4 days and it wouldn't affect recovery rates. It's possible that if we went below an average length of stay of 4 days, maybe recovery rates would tank, but the argument isn't making that claim. It's not saying that. The final choice, E, says that patients generally prefer a longer stay at the hospital. The only way that this could be a flaw is if somehow the stimulus connected patient preferences with quality of care. But it never makes that connection. So in the context of this question, we can ignore what patients want. But let's just consider a hypothetical answer, just so we can learn a little bit more about this question. What if there was an answer choice that said something along the lines of, the argument presumes without justification that average length of stay may not be relevant to quality of care. Now that answer choice would be a scary good answer, because if we were really creative in thinking about flaws that could be in this argument, we might have thought that couldn't Edgewater Hospital just be a lousy hospital? Maybe, both hospitals really do. They treat patients that all have the same illnesses, okay? But maybe whatever illness they all treat patients for really does take an average of 6 full days to recover from. And Edgewater Hospital is just booting people to the curb, to save bed space and to make money. Now, that would be a great answer, but it doesn't exist. Okay, that's not one of the choices. So, to wrap up, let's talk about how we can get better at identifying the flaw present in this problem. A good habit would be to make a list of flaws that you encounter when you do problems like this, flaw in the reasoning problems. And whether or not you get the problem right, definitely if you get it wrong, you should focus in on the language that's in the stimulus. So in this case, in this problem, the word average should have clued us in that we're talking about a group as a whole. And then the word similar should have clued us in that we're comparing groups. Well, which groups? Groups of patients who have similar illnesses. And then if we think about those groups we're comparing, we would realize that they are subgroups within the larger group. And then we would be well on our way to getting the correct answer. The other thing about that is it points us in the right direction because we'd be looking for answer choice C. The question itself is pointing us in that direction, and then so we wouldn't be off track looking for an answer like the bad hospital hypothetical I suggested and wasting our time looking for an answer choice that's just not there. So having a working knowledge of common LSAT flaws and the language that indicates them is the key to efficiently working through these types of problems. That's studying smart, and that's how you make progress on the LSAT.